On the 18th of October 1944, Germany buried its most celebrated soldier with the full ceremonial weight of a nation that still had months of war ahead of it. The streets of Ulm were lined with soldiers standing at attention. The coffin, draped with his field marshal's baton, was carried by senior officers who had served with him across 3 continents. Hitler sent a wreath and a personal tribute praising Rommel's courage and his sacrifice for the fatherland. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had argued with Rommel for months about the best way to defend Normandy, delivered the eulogy. He spoke of a hero who had given everything, of a warrior whose wounds had finally claimed what the enemy could not. The flags of the Third Reich flew at half-staff. The official cause of death was a brain seizure, resulting from the wounds Rommel had sustained when his staff car was strafed by British aircraft on July 17th. The announcement had gone out from the army. The newspapers had printed it. The radio had broadcast it across the country. Germany mourned a general who had died in the service of his country. None of it was true. 4 days earlier, on October 14th, 1944, Erwin Rommel had been alive and recovering at his home in the village of Herrlingen, in the German state of Württemberg. He had been sitting in his study, in the house where he had spent his childhood summers, reading. His wife Lucie was upstairs. His 15-year-old son Manfred was in the house, and shortly after noon, 2 Wehrmacht staff cars had turned into the quiet village lane and stopped in front of the house. To understand what those 2 cars meant, and why Rommel walked out to meet them, you have to understand what had happened to him in the months between July and October, and what, in a life of extraordinary professional achievement, those months had ultimately cost. Erwin Rommel had spent the first years of the war as the Wehrmacht's most luminous figure. He was the commander who made history look effortless, whose victories in France and North Africa had turned him into something the German military had not quite produced before. A popular hero, a celebrity general whose exploits were celebrated in the newspapers and on the newsreels with an intensity that made his name recognizable to people who had never had any interest in military affairs. The Desert Fox. The name had attached itself to him in North Africa and never quite let go. He was brave, personally present at the front in a way that senior German commanders rarely were. Aggressive in the finest tradition of Auftragstaktik, and possessed of a tactical instinct that consistently produced results faster than the conventional logic of the situations he was given seemed to allow. He had also, by the spring of 1944, become something that the German High Command was less comfortable with: honest. The experience of North Africa had stripped away whatever remained of his early optimism about the war's outcome. He had watched his beloved Afrika Korps be dismantled by Allied air power, supply line attrition, and the mathematics of a war Germany was not equipped to win on the terms it had been given. He had learned that professional excellence was not, by itself, a sufficient answer to industrial capacity combined with strategic position. And he had brought this learning to France, where his argument with von Rundstedt about the defense of Normandy was, at its core, not really an argument about tactics at all. It was an argument about whether the war in the West was even winnable under any circumstances. His private letters to his wife Lucie in the spring of 1944 are documents of a man doing a professional calculation that is arriving at answers he cannot state publicly and cannot entirely stop himself from thinking. He wrote about the beauty of the Norman landscape. He wrote about the men under his command and the impossibility of what was being asked of them. He wrote about the gap between what Germany had and what it needed to defeat an Allied landing. And between the lines of the careful professional language, the conclusion he could not quite put into words was already there. He put it into words on July 15, 1944, 2 days before the strafing attack that would nearly kill him. in a formal memorandum to Hitler that his son would later describe as the most important document his father ever wrote. The memorandum ran to several pages. It documented the military situation in Normandy, with the kind of precise professional analysis that Rommel had always brought to operational questions: force ratios, supply rates, casualty comparisons, the rate of Allied buildup against the rate of German reinforcement. Every figure pointed in the same direction. Every calculation arrived at the same answer. The Normandy landings had been made. The beachhead was established. The Allied air power Rommel had warned about was operating over it continuously, making every German counterattack costly before it reached the battle. The reinforcement of the beachhead was proceeding faster than the German defense could attrit it. The military situation in the West was, his memorandum concluded, hopeless. He asked Hitler to draw the necessary conclusions. He was not asking for permission to surrender. He was telling the head of the German state, in the bluntest possible language permitted by military protocol, that the war in the West could not be won, and that Germany's political leadership needed to act on that fact before the military situation deteriorated further. It was the closest thing to a resignation that the Wehrmacht's professional code permitted. 2 days later, on July 17th, his staff car was attacked by 2 British Typhoon fighter bombers on a Norman country road near the town of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The attack came without warning, as Typhoon attacks always did. A scream from above, cannon fire tearing up the road surface in a line of explosions that moved faster than a running man. The driver was killed. The car veered off the road at high speed and crashed into the verge. Rommel was thrown forward and out, striking the road surface hard enough to fracture his skull in 4 places, shatter his cheekbone, and sustain injuries to his left eye that would permanently impair his vision. He was unconscious when they found him. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a German civilian hospital, and eventually, in early August, to Herrlingen to continue his recovery at home. The doctors who examined him told his family it was remarkable that he had survived. The injuries were the kind that killed most men outright. He was still at Herrlingen on July 20th, when a small group of German officers and civilians who had been planning to assassinate Adolf Hitler carried out their attempt and failed. The July 20th conspiracy, known to history as Operation Valkyrie, was not a simple or unified event. It had been building for years, drawing together officers and civilians who had reached different conclusions about Hitler at different times, through different experiences, and were connected to each other through relationships that overlapped and intersected in ways that were not always fully clear, even to the participants. At its core was a military officer named Claus von Stauffenberg, who placed a bomb in a briefcase in Hitler's headquarters. Hitler survived. The conspirators were arrested. The interrogations began. What exactly Rommel knew about the plot, and when he knew it, remains one of the genuinely contested questions of the final year of the war. The evidence assembled in the post-war period, from the Gestapo's own interrogation records and from the testimony of survivors, points toward a complicated picture. Rommel had known, through conversations with his chief of staff Hans Speidel and with a civilian contact named Karl Strolin, that there were discussions underway about replacing the Nazi government. He had apparently agreed that Germany's political situation needed to change radically. He had apparently indicated that if a new German government were established and sought to negotiate a ceasefire in the West, he would support it. Whether he knew about the specific assassination plot, whether he endorsed the killing of Hitler, is less clear. Rommel's own consistent position, stated privately and apparently maintained under the pressure of events, was that Hitler should be arrested and tried rather than killed. Whether this was a genuine moral scruple, a tactical calculation about the aftermath of an assassination, or a memory carefully shaped by his surviving family to protect his reputation, historians continue to disagree. What is clear is that the Gestapo's investigation reached him. The interrogations extracted names. The names were connected to networks. The networks were connected to conversations Rommel had had. By September of 1944, the trap was being built around him, brick by brick, testimony by testimony, in the interrogation rooms of Berlin. He knew it was closing. The arrest of Speidel in September was not ambiguous. Speidel was his chief of staff. Speidel knew everything Rommel knew. Speidel's arrest was, for anyone reading the situation clearly, an announcement that the investigation had reached Rommel's own headquarters. He could not have misunderstood what it meant. He spent September and the early weeks of October at Herrlingen, recovering physically from his wounds, managing the knowledge of what was coming with a composure that his son Manfred would later describe as the most extraordinary thing he ever witnessed in another human being. He continued to read. He walked in the garden with a cane when his injuries permitted. He wrote letters. He talked with Lucie and Manfred in the evenings. He did not discuss what he knew was coming, except in one conversation with Manfred in early October that the young man would remember for the rest of his life. He told his son, simply and without drama, that he did not expect to survive the autumn. He did not specify the mechanism. He did not burden his 15-year-old son with the details of the political machinery that was assembling itself against him. He simply told him that he wanted him to know, to remember, that whatever was said officially about what had happened, the truth was that he had tried to do what was right, according to his professional judgment and his conscience. That was all he said. Manfred did not sleep well for many nights after that conversation. On the morning of October 14th, Rommel had been up since early. His head still gave him pain from the July injuries, but he was mobile. He ate breakfast with the family. He read. The autumn morning was cool and gray in the way of the Swabian countryside at that time of year, the kind of quiet that an October day has when nothing has yet disturbed it. Shortly after noon, a staff car turned into the narrow lane that ran past the Rommel house, followed closely by a second. Manfred, who was in the house, heard the cars. He went to a window. Two generals in full Wehrmacht dress uniform stepped out. He did not recognize them immediately, but he recognized what two generals arriving unannounced at a convalescent field marshal's home in the middle of the afternoon without prior notification meant. He had been living inside the German military system for his entire conscious life. He understood its rituals and its absences. Generals did not visit recovering field marshals this way unless the visit had a purpose that could not be communicated by letter or telephone. General Wilhelm Burgdorf was the senior, a large, heavy man, an officer whose function within the Wehrmacht had become, by 1944, essentially political. He served as the Army's chief personnel officer, which meant he served as the instrument through which the political will of Hitler's government was translated into military action. The second general was Ernst Meisel. They had come from Berlin. They had brought a letter. Manfred was in the house when the cars arrived. He went to a window and watched. He was 15 years old, and he understood, in the way that 15-year-old sons of field marshals understand things in the fourth year of a catastrophic war, that what he was looking at was not a routine headquarters visit. Rommel met the two generals in his study. The conversation that followed was recorded in its general outlines by Manfred, who learned the details from his father in the few minutes they had together before the end. Burgdorf presented the situation plainly. The investigation had concluded. The evidence against Rommel was sufficient. He had two options. The first was to appear before the People's Court in Berlin on charges of participating in the conspiracy against the Führer. The People's Court, by 1944, was not a judicial body in any meaningful sense. It was an instrument of execution. An appearance before it was a death sentence that would be preceded by public humiliation, and that would carry consequences for Rommel's family, Lucie, Manfred, anyone connected to him. The second option was simpler. He could take the cyanide capsule that Bergdorf had brought with him. He would be dead within 15 minutes. The official announcement would state that he had died of his wounds. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His family would receive his field marshal's pension. His name would remain, officially, what it had been before this day. The cover story had already been prepared. Rommel asked for 15 minutes with his family. Bergdorf allowed it. He went upstairs to where Lucie was waiting. The details of that conversation have never been fully recorded. Lucie Rommel did not speak publicly about its specifics, and the privacy she maintained around those 15 minutes is itself a kind of testimony to what happened inside them. What is documented is that she knew, that she had known, in the way that a woman who has been married for nearly 30 years to a man who is being hunted knows, before the two cars arrived, that the autumn was not going to end well. The conversation was short. It could not have been easy, and it could not have been long enough, and then Rommel went to find his son. Manfred was on the stairs when his father appeared. The account Manfred gave in his memoir, written decades later, is the most precise record we have of what happened in the next few minutes. Rommel told him about the two choices. He told him, briefly and without embellishment, which one he had decided to take. He told Manfred that he had a quarter of an hour. He said goodbye. Then he went to his bedroom. He changed out of the civilian clothes he had been wearing and put on his Afrika Korps uniform. The khaki tunic and trousers of the desert campaign, the uniform from the theater that had defined him most completely in the public imagination and in his own professional memory. Not the dress uniform of a field marshal with its gold braid and decorations. The working uniform of a soldier in a specific campaign. The one that had been made famous in 100 newspaper photographs. The one that people associated with the name Desert Fox. Whether this choice was deliberate or automatic, whether it carried meaning or was simply the uniform that came first to hand, no one has ever been certain. He came back downstairs with the cane he still needed because of his injuries. He walked out the front door of the house he had grown up near, the house where his son had spent his childhood, the house his wife was watching from a window upstairs. He walked with his cane, unhurried, in the precise measured pace of a professional soldier making a professional choice under the one circumstance in which professional soldiers are most truly tested, the circumstance where the choice is between dying with their dignity or surviving without it. General Bergdorf met him at the car. Rommel got in the back seat. Bergdorf got in beside him. Maisel drove. The car moved away from the house. Manfred watched it from the front steps. Lucie watched from the window. The car drove out of the village and onto the Blaubeuren road and stopped on a quiet stretch, out of sight of the houses. What happened next took approximately 15 minutes. Rommel's driver, who had been sent ahead in the second car, was told to wait. The two generals got out of the car. Rommel remained in the back seat. One of them returned to the car briefly, then they drove on to a hospital in Ulm. The medical personnel at the hospital were told that Field Marshal Rommel had suffered a brain seizure, a recurrence of the damage sustained in July. His body was examined. The true cause of death, cyanide poisoning, was apparently noted by at least one medical professional and apparently suppressed. The official cause of death was recorded as the seizure. The telephone call to Herrlingen came within the hour. Field Marshal Rommel was dead. He had suffered a fatal seizure. He had died, as the Wehrmacht's official announcement would shortly state, as a result of the terrible wounds he had received in the service of his country. Lucie Rommel knew this was false before the telephone rang. Manfred knew before the telephone rang. They had watched him walk to the car. They had seen Bergdorf's face. They had heard 30 minutes of silence from their windows before the phone rang. The state funeral on October 18th was a masterpiece of organized deception. Von Rundstedt delivered a eulogy that praised a general who had died in battle. Hitler's personal representative laid a wreath. The coffin was carried through streets lined with soldiers. The churches were full. The newspapers carried tributes that praised Rommel's loyalty, his courage, his service to the fatherland. In a country that had been told to believe that its generals were fighting and dying for a just cause, the funeral offered a version of the war's human cost that fit comfortably inside the existing narrative. The truth did not emerge until after Germany's defeat, when Allied investigators began piecing together what had happened to the men connected to the July 20th conspiracy. The Gestapo's own records, recovered from archives in Berlin and Frankfurt, documented the investigation that had closed around Rommel in the autumn of 1944. The interrogation transcripts of the July 20th conspirators, many of whom were executed at Plötzensee prison in the months between the failed assassination and Germany's surrender, contained the names and the conversations that had been used to build the case against him. And Manfred Rommel, 19 years old and living in the ruins of the country his father had spent his career defending, began to tell what he knew. His testimony, given to Allied investigators and later published in various forms over the following decades, is the primary source through which we understand what happened at Herrlingen on October 14th. He spoke with the specific clarity of someone who has had years to organize an experience that was over in less than an hour, but that has constituted, in some ways, the central event of his conscious life. The two cars arriving, the generals in the house, the conversation with his father on the stairs, the figure in the Afrika Korps uniform walking to the car with the cane, the car moving away, the silence, the telephone. What he did not speak about, and what no survivor's account has ever fully addressed, is what those 15 minutes between the car leaving and the telephone ringing were like for the two people watching from the Rommel house on the Blaubeuren Road. The war in which Erwin Rommel served lasted 4 more months after his death. Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945. The government that had sent 2 generals to his front door with a cyanide capsule ceased to exist. The People's Court that would have tried him was dissolved. The judges who presided over the trials of the other July 20th conspirators were themselves tried as war criminals. The official account that he died of his wounds was discredited in the post-war investigations. His reputation was restored, at least in part, by the same testimony that revealed how he had actually died. The army that had covered his death with a false story eventually acknowledged the truth. The country he served built a memorial to him. His son became the mayor of Stuttgart and lived until 2013, carrying the memory of that October morning for 69 years. In the village of Herrlingen, the house where he spent his last weeks still stands. The lane that the 2 staff cars drove down is still there. The window from which Lucie Rommel watched her husband make his last walk is still there. The Afrika Korps uniform he chose to wear is in a museum. The field marshal's baton that was laid on his coffin is in another. Neither of them tells the complete story. The complete story ended on a country road outside a Swabian village, in the back seat of a car, 15 minutes after a man said goodbye to his wife and son and walked out of his own front door for the last time. It ended because he was a soldier, and because he understood, with the same tactical clarity he had applied to everything else in his professional life, that there was no third option. That the 2 choices he had been given were the only ones, and that of the 2, only one would leave his family intact and his name usable by his son. He had spent his career choosing between bad options and finding ways to win. From the desperate night actions in the mountains of Romania in the First World War, to the armored thrust through the Ardennes in 1940, to the desert campaigns that made his name a synonym for improvised audacity, every chapter of his professional life had involved the same essential skill: identifying the least bad option in a situation that had no good ones, and executing it with complete commitment. This was the one time the options offered no version of winning. The trial meant disgrace and death, and the destruction of everything he might still protect. The capsule meant death, and the preservation of what little could be preserved. He chose the one that gave something to the people watching from the window. That was the last tactical decision of Erwin Rommel's professional life.